About the, just as an aside, about the thing you mentioned about Superman marrying Lois Lane and them having a baby on the way. Reminds me of an old Larry Niven essay.
Man of Steel, Woman of Kleenex.
Man of Steel, Woman of Kleenex.
Yep.
So people like read it, you should look it up. It argues that such a thing would be physically impossible.
Biologically impossible. Just imagine Superman and the indestructible Superman and the very fragile Lois Lane together in the throes of lovemaking. It's not a pretty picture.
We were always wondering about that. Thank you.
Right.
Nathan, thank you for your presentation. I came here tonight, one, to get educated, because the last time I looked at a comic book was probably 45 years ago. So I'm deeply disturbed and deeply fascinated by your level of knowledge and what's going on. So my question is this. For the uninitiated like me, what comic is good? What superhero is actually promoting the ideas of liberty and freedom? And what comic book would you suggest to get to your grandchild? I have no idea.
Anything written by Frank Miller.
That's actually good index. That's actually a really hard question to answer, Brad, and I'll tell you why. The question was, what's a good comic book to give to a child or a grandchild? What's a good place to start? And the thing is, it has grown so enormously. I went to my very first comic book convention around 1985, 1986. I was a teenager. There were maybe a couple hundred people there. By the way, interesting fact about Denver Comic Con. This is Denver Comic Con's 4th year in existence. Their first year, 2012, they drew 27,000 people. This year, they had over 101,000 attendees. It has gotten huge. I think it's the 3rd biggest convention in the country after New York and San Diego. It is absolutely enormous. But so this is a big eye-opener to me. After this very first convention I went to when I was a teenager, a couple hundred people, maybe a half dozen to a dozen vendors, maybe about that many artists. And I remember this one thing. At that particular convention, I went by one particular vendor, and I noticed a comic book that I would later on absolutely regret not buying. It was there on the stands, brand new, it just come out. It was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #3. That book is now worth hundreds of dollars. If I had ever obtained #1, that would be worth over $1,000. I haven't looked it up in a while, but it's of enormous value. And the thing is, at that time, I was a little bit slow on the bandwagon. Everybody else already knew about this. There was a comic book series, I mentioned it earlier, the character Ozymandias came from a comic book from the late 80s called Watchmen. And at the time that Watchmen was coming out, everybody in comic book fandom knew about this one. And when Frank Miller did The Dark Knight Returns in 1986, again, everybody in fandom knew about it. We all went out and bought it. I contrast this with the situation now. Walking the floor of the convention at Denver Comic Con, I saw people dressed as DC superheroes, Marvel superheroes, White Wolf superheroes, Vertigo superheroes, video game characters, movie characters, television show characters, manga, that's Japanese comic books, characters, and I maybe recognized 3%, 5% of the characters that I saw the various attendees dressed as. Geek culture has not only grown in popularity, it's grown in breadth, and it's grown in depth. And there is, I think, no way for any one person to be aware of the full survey. So in a way, that's an impossible question to answer. I just don't know everything that's out there. Most of my references are honestly 15 to 20 years old. Now, that said, yes, Frank Miller is a writer. He wrote and made The Dark Knight Returns back in 1986. Does anybody remember a movie called 300 about the Spartans? Yeah, he wrote the graphic novel, wrote and drew the graphic novel that movie was based on. Another one that came out a few years ago, Sin City. Sin City 2 was out last year. He wrote and drew the graphic novel that was based on. And Frank Miller has become a very libertarian-bent conservative in a lot of ways. He always kind of was there, although back in the 80s, he thought he was a liberal and he wrote like it. But anybody with an eye to see could see these other strains emerging out. That's, beyond that, especially if you're getting them for kids, here's my recommendation. Buy them yourself and read them yourself. Peruse the books on the stacks. Find out what's there. See what you like. See what you don't like. And use that as the basis for your guidance. And along the way, you get to educate yourself on this area of the popular culture that maybe you don't know anything about. And it's a lot of fun. You get to indulge your inner 5-year-old. That's always a great time. Another side note, Brad, that you reminded me of, you said the last time you looked at this stuff was 45 years ago. One of the most interesting panels that I attended was about the comic books code in the 1950s. In the 1950s, prior to the 1950s, I guess I should say, comic books were kind of the Wild West in that there was no ruling code, there was no censorship going on. There were crime comics that were very bloody. There were horror comics that were terrifying and displayed moldering corpses and buckets of blood, and it just was all over the place. And there was one publisher of a whole line of horror comics who ran afoul of some of his fellow creators and of government censors. So they held a series of hearings about this. And at the end of this came about the Comic Books Authority. And for 30 years after that point, every comic book on the stand that they wanted to be mass distributed, they had to have approved by the Comic Books Authority, a little seal on the cover. And in order to get that seal, they had to follow certain rules. No nudity, obviously, but not even skimpy clothing. No bad language, no visible blood, no homosexuality depicted was specifically stipulated, no vampires, no werewolves, no mummies, no titles like horror comics, weird comics, detective comics, titles like that were ruled out. It was draconian. And so for a long period in the 50s and 60s, you had comic books that were just, to be honest, deathly dull. They were written for the lowest common denominator, 5-year-old. And it was only in the 60s and 70s when things started to liven up a bit, and in the 1980s when everything kind of went boom and there was a huge explosion of creativity, and everybody said, forget the comics code. Because it was, and this is the one redeeming, this is the one redeeming feature. The comic books code was entirely voluntary. It was not a government agency. It was a private agency. And the only punishment was, you don't follow our rules, you can't get our seal on the cover. And if you don't get our seal on the cover, well then, Walgreens isn't going to carry you, Wall Drug isn't going to carry you, Barnes & Noble's not going to carry it. This is, before Barnes & Noble, obviously. But you get the idea. So it was entirely privately policed. And that's the one good thing about it, apart from the fact that it was pure out-and-out censorship. But interesting, that was a really fascinating panel, and it was put on by an organization that I'd never heard of before called the Comic Books Legal Defense Fund, CBLDF. Very cool to know that that's out there.
So capitalism took over, and they found other outlets for their comic books.
Yes, they did,
nice.
Actually. The graphic novel, the whole phenomenon of the graphic novel. A graphic novel is a comic book that's got nice binding and printed on very good quality, not cheap pulp paper, but good quality paper, sometimes almost cardstock, vivid colors, and usually has very graphic content depicted as well. I'm trying to remember what the first graphic novel was. I can't think right now. Oh, I remember. The first one of any real note was an X-Men graphic novel called God Loves, Man Kills. And it featured a character who was depicted in the second X-Men movie, William Stryker, who in this telling was a televangelist preacher who was running the secret anti-mutant task force behind the scenes. And it was very graphic. I remember reading it, just horrified at some of the things I saw. It did not have the comics code on the cover, and it sold very well. So yes, absolutely free market in action. Any other? Yes?
Going off of Brad's question of the best comic books, like I just stated, Captain Planet is probably one of the most worthless superheroes ever created. All you need is a free market, and you wouldn't need Captain Planet. But what would you say is some of worthless superheroes or superheroes that you think people should stay away from?
Aquaman.
Well, Aquaman's just lame. I honestly, I couldn't say.
Sorry.
No, I honestly couldn't say. And let me tell you why. That one is I couldn't say, and second is I wouldn't say even if I could. And there's a very important reason. First thing, why I couldn't say. Because again, there's so much out there, A, and B, a lot of it really comes down to individual taste. I see your point about Captain Planet, but let's say you got a character like Captain Planet, who is very, very, very popular. Okay? And let's say we've got a character who is just enormously popular. All the kids are reading him. Now, what is the better way? Now, for those of you who don't know, Captain Planet is a character. He was on a children's cartoon in the 90s, and he was basically an environmental evangelist. And we're talking, he's the voice of the extreme enviro left. And I have no idea actually how popular Captain Planet ever was. I never watched it.
I loved him as a kid.
Okay.
I grew up.
Perfect. Okay. Well, let's take that. You loved him as a kid. Now, suppose loving him as a kid, some adult had come to you and said, turn that off. That's crap. That's junk. Would you have listened to that adult?
I asked my dad why he didn't, but then I realized if he did, I probably would have kept watching it.
You would have kept watching it, and then,
I would have said, he's better. Oh, my dad's wrong. He's right.
and then when your dad came to you and started wanting to talk to you about something really important, some important philosophic idea, how much has his stock gone down in your eyes because he dissed your favorite superhero?
As a little kid, yeah, quite a lot.
Right. This is one of the biggest mistakes that we make, and I've said this before, I'll say it again. We go out and attack the things that we don't like that other people do. Miley Cyrus, remember her? Remember twerking? I made a big bugbear about this 2 years ago. I'm still on it. How many kids who liked Miley Cyrus were persuaded by adults complaining about her twerking? This many. Okay, one. Good. Okay, fine. But how old are you? 12. Okay, so you haven't yet hit the rebellious period. Come back to me in 4 years. I'm being censored. I said a bad. Yes.
Your last comment, its validity notwithstanding, it is valid. To what extent do you think, by focusing on these, we're dealing with effects and not cause?
We might be. We very well might be. But I think that's the wrong question. The question is, what are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to accomplish?
Influence the culture.
Influence the culture. Why?
Freedom.
That doesn't really address the question. What's the can anybody give me the stock phrase here? Culture sits upstream of politics, or politics sits downstream of culture. If you've got somebody who is already persuaded by the culture, let's just take a kind of contentious example. Gay marriage. Now, probably, I'm going to guess most people in here don't really have a big bug in their bonnet about gay marriage, but let's say you did. Let's say to you, gay marriage was absolutely anathema. How much can really be accomplished? I saw a poll recently, 60% of Americans now favor gay marriage. 60%. Now let's leave aside the question of whether or not that's accurate. Let's assume for the sake of argument that it is accurate. If that is accurate, you go out and you make a crusade out of passing laws banning gay marriage. What have you accomplished? You have alienated 60% of the voting public. It's too late. That horse is out of the barn, culturally speaking. If you were to go back 10 years, the thing to do was not pass laws about gay marriage. The thing to do was to get messages out in the culture or to strum the strings of messages that were already there. That's what it means to approach culture rather than politics. How many people here have produced a $500 million grossing movie this year? Does anybody know someone who's produced a $500 million grossing movie? Okay, let's make it a little bit more modest. How about a book that sold upwards of $1 million? Anybody? Know anybody?
Don't berate our audience.
We're not, no, I'm not berating. I'm not berating. I'm making a point, which is we are not content producers here. We get a few rare instances. We get an Adam Baldwin. We get a Kelsey Grammer. We get a John Voight. They're content producers, and God bless them. But we're not content producers. And so affecting the culture that way is beyond the reach of most of us. Okay, but so what can we do? Well, this is kind of the point. The messages that comic books tell are out there in the culture already, and there are themes in them that we can use. There are themes that point to the individual is more important than the collective. There are themes that point to rights matter. There are themes that point to you don't get to control what other people do. And when talking to people about culture, we can say, yeah, I love Batman. And in fact, I love this one aspect, and go in the direction that you want to go. But you can't do that if you started off with those Batman comics are crap. You've closed the door. You're done. By addressing the culture where it is, rather than saying, don't like Captain Planet, don't like this particular villain. By going where people live, you get to actually talk to them. That's the point I want to get across. Yes?
How much of the comic world and graphic novel world is going to go into digital exclusively and out of paper?
How much of the comic book world, graphic novel world, is going to go exclusively into digital? I have a horrible crystal ball when it comes to stuff like that. And also, this is a debate that's been going on for my entire adult life. People said print is dead, and then I got 3 more forms to fill out. There are people like me. I love my books. Cody will testify. We got shelves and shelves and shelves of books. Why? Because I can get it down. I can flip through the pages. I can lift the spine up to my nose and smell that paper smell. And there's a lot of people who are like me. We're tactile creatures. We like to use all 5 senses. Purely digital, that's all visual. So,
intersection between superheroes and, say, games, online games.
Oh, sure. Well, that's been growing, and I predict it will keep growing. How far? I couldn't say. I'm not a gamer. That's my one weakness as a geek. I've talked to a couple of people about this. Here's the thing about me and video games. You got to know where the crack is, and you've got to avoid the crack. Stay away from the crack. And for me, video games are pure, 100% crack, and I can't touch them. Mm-mm. Anything else?
I got a question.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about the other kinds of questions that were coming from the panel? What kind of the responses were, if you can narrow down their kind of ideology there? And did you have any breakthroughs with the audience? 170 people is an impressive number.
Yeah, not what I would call breakthroughs. I would say we got some good points across. One of my favorite questions was, and this is just purely because from a literary standpoint, this kind of thing is fascinating to me. What is the difference between an antagonist and a villain? An antagonist is an obstacle put in the way of the protagonist. The protagonist has the place that they want to go. An antagonist is a character who comes up and gets in their way. Now, they may not mean to do it. They may just be, on their own way to someplace else, and they just happen to bump into each other. Or it could be somebody who has outright malignant intentions, and thus they are a villain. That was, I thought, a very cool question. One guy asked me what other categories, or actually, no, I think we asked the audience what other categories of villains they might suggest. And one guy, Cody, what was the phrase he used?
It's villain not by choice, but by force.
Villain by choice, not by force. That is, somebody who is sort of... What's that?
Villain by force.
Villain by force, right. Somebody who is sort of pressed into villainy by circumstances. And he also made a point about characters who kind of ride the line constantly. Today they're a hero, next day they're a villain, back and forth, raising the whole question of moral ambiguity, which that's my favorite kind of question in a way, because that you then get to ask, well, how do they know when they've crossed the line? How do we know when they've crossed the line? And you then get to ask probing questions. And it's kind of a difficult thing to do, really, because there are in fact moral gray areas. The analogy that I use, I'm an old graphics person from way back. Adobe Photoshop, anybody? And one of the things you can do with Adobe Photoshop, I remember this very clearly working on a photograph of the ocean. Ever take one of those pictures where the ocean meets the sky and you can't really tell where the line is? But if you need to know where the line is, like I want to do something to the sky but not the ocean, anybody know a good way to find it? There's a tool you can use in Photoshop to adjust the levels. You take the black point and you move it up. So the darker pixels all become black. And you take the white point and you move it down so the lighter pixels all go to white. And basically you're increasing the contrast. And you increase it until you get to this line. Now, you're dealing now with a black and white picture rather than all the shades of gray we deal with in real life, but that helps you see where the line is. A lot of the probing questions we ask about philosophy and morality serve the same purpose. They take things to extremes that are perhaps unrealistic, but that's kind of the point. You have to sometimes take things to the unrealistic, logically extrapolate them out to the nth degree to find out, oh, okay, There's the line. So that was an interesting question as well. Anybody else have any questions? Yes.
Line there. A lot of the left is moving. One of their big pushes is egalitarianism. Okay, equal worth to me is not something that really is something you should have everybody at. There are people that don't care, that don't work, that don't care about working. There are people that achieve greatness, and so I don't think you should I don't think that line should say equal worth. I think it should say equal rights.
Okay, but and that's a good point. The last line should say equal rights rather than equal worth, because equal worth, that kind of egalitarianism, is perhaps not consistent with conservative principles. And I can see that point. One of the things that Len and I were trying to do, again, we're trying to sneak certain ideas under the radar. Here we are at a comic book convention. The people who run it have a demonstrably leftward bent, maybe not extreme, but it's there. If we go in just saying outright everything that we actually mean, well, maybe we're not even going to get to do a panel. Maybe they're just going to say, yeah, no. So we have to be sneaky. We have to be subversive. And so putting things in those terms, that helps us to be a little bit sneakier and get things under the radar. Anything else? Well, then I want to thank you guys. Oh, was there one I'm missing?
I was going to say, do you have an example of what would you consider the most virtuous hero?
Ooh, that's a good one. Our answer was offered of Rorschach from The Watchmen. Rorschach is a bit of a sociopath, so I'm going to say no on Rorschach. My first inclination, honestly, is Superman. And here's why I say Superman. It's perhaps not for the obvious reasons. For me, Superman is a character of absolutely inhuman restraint. Here's a character with a very solid morality. This is right, this is wrong. And it's a morality that corresponds very closely to my own. Now, here you have somebody who can do, depending upon which version of the character you read, almost anything. He can fly, he can lift pretty much anything. In one version, he can fly so fast that he can turn the direction of the world backwards on itself and reverse time to undo something bad. That's an extreme example, I grant you. But he is incredibly powerful, and he has this enormously forceful morality guiding him. What is to stop him from becoming a tyrant? What is to stop a Superman from saying, I'm sick of watching all of you kill each other, steal from each other, rape and kidnap and do all these other horrible things? It stops, and it stops now. No more. He can be almost anywhere almost instantly. He's got X-ray vision. He can see what's going on. And he's certainly got the force to impose his will. What stops a Superman from becoming a tyrant? There's only one thing, and that's Superman.
Not laws and regulations.
No, actually, this is one of the things about superhero characters. Every single one of them is an outlaw. Every single one of them is a vigilante who operates outside the bounds of law. This is one of the problems that we dealt with last year. They're all operating not according to laws and regulations, but according to their own morality. And what makes them good is the fact that the morality that guides them is one that says you don't go beating somebody up unless they were already beating somebody else up. And Superman is sort of the perfect crystalline example of this. I really can't think of any better.
Is that it? Anybody else? Let's thank Nathan.
Thank you, guys. I have a blog and a podcast that is found at www.bigmessybites. I post about anything and everything having to do with popular culture. So if you enjoy this kind of thing, please check me out. Find me on Facebook. Friend me there. I'll direct you to my Facebook page for the New Renaissance, and you can see updates there. Thank you all so much.